Yeah, just a few quick hits here, and sort of two hidden secrets about elections in 2020, and maybe for this audience, they're not big secrets. The first is that we need to relearn first principles. So as George Gallup proselytized, these are randomness and reach, right? So breadth of opinion and randomness of opinion when he invented the Mall Intercept survey, not so-called representativeness. This was the post-mortem on 2016 and after Brexit, this idea that we had a crisis of respondents. That's no doubt true. But the real foundational problem is we need to get a truly random sample, and we need to be broad in our reach, and reach what I say in point 2, which is those quiet voices. That's what RIWI specializes in, right? People who do not participate in traditional online polls, who do not traditionally post angry posts on Twitter. These are the people who decide elections. They decided them in 2016. They decided them, frankly, in every single major binary event that we've looked at, and I would suggest that it matter even more today. Next slide, please. So thank you. You know, we've been in this business for 10 years or so, sort of got our attention really with having predicted the fall of Mubarak, having listened to the Arab street, that context of listening to the street people, everyday people. And statistically, the 2016 election was relatively easy for us. It was a consistent signal and animus toward Secretary Clinton really rising in the prior 3 weeks prior to Election Day. Things are different this time around, and I'd suggest to you that narratives are more important and how they're adjusted by either party. Could I have the next slide, please? So, you know, this is the traditional winning narrative, right? And by this narrative, especially after COVID-19 was declared a national emergency, this would suggest that the president and the Republicans are in trouble. On this traditional narrative, there's a clear signal that people do not feel they're better off today than they were 4 years ago. But the next slide tells an important point. And that is that what we're finding, and these are tens of thousands of respondents, and we're just gearing up. You know, we're just gearing up here. What we're finding is this, and this is among likely voters, people who are passionate about voting. And this is a very broad swath of public opinion. These are not people who are reported in traditional online polls. Essentially, you've got a wide proportion of individuals who are unable to say they have enough information to predict who's going to win in their particular state. So that tells me, and this is my last slide, in the next slide, that these are the kind of narratives that matter more in this election. Things have changed. No doubt, the traditional narratives matter about whether people feel better off than they were 4 years prior. But we're looking at things like vaccine hesitancy, that I put in quotes because I don't like that term, because it's dynamic, and we're looking at it in all parts of the world. And it's an important narrative to understand. This is how we evaluate the last mile of the coronavirus pandemic, right? How do we ensure that people take 1-2 doses of a highly effective vaccine and get it have it in their arms? So it's a proxy on trust in public health authorities. And this is different in different parts of the world. How do we, and this of course connects to herd immunity being that goal that we're all after. So this is one narrative among many. And I would suggest to you that as we think about the election, let's be a little more creative than moving just beyond asking a very, very small sliver of the population who increasingly don't answer phone calls at 6 p.m. at dinner about who they prefer to win. Thank you. And I hope this frames.
Interesting. We'll get back to that because I'd love to talk about a little bit more later on about how you predicted the 2016 outcome when it blew the rest of us away. But in the meantime, I think this is a really good segue to ask Tanya to go into some sentiment about COVID. So speaking of vaccine, so Tanya, can you just talk a little about what Arenda Solutions is seeing and how you can lay a layer of your data over this election and what we're hearing right now?
Yeah, so when we decided that we would start pulling in COVID, we pulled in, we decided it was really important to the election for a number of reasons. It was non-denominational. It doesn't care what your social status is or what race you are or where you live, what state you live in. It was a broad sweeping issue. So we decided we would start to watch it closely and how it tied back to both Trump and Biden. And since we started tracking it over the last several months, there have been 4 significant hits to mostly Trump, of course. And today actually being the biggest one out of the entire time that we've been tracking it, which we think is interesting. For the most part, I mean, people were looking at it as milestones, that negative milestones. So the number of deaths are something that people are very concerned about, of course, over 191,000 currently. And the way it's being handled, Neil mentioned trust. Trust is something that we measure in real time, and trust has dropped significantly today. It makes a lot of sense because Trump is being pulled out as lying in terms of what he believed was the true potential for a death spiral the way it is currently. And that has hit the conversations that we track on social media, which is hundreds of thousands, in a very significant way. And if we were to look at it in terms of Biden, they feel that, there's still concerns about his cognitive abilities. He's not the perfect solution, but he's better than Trump is what people are saying. And he should be the frontliner due to Trump's constant failures. So when we talk about a tipping point, a common tipping point, in a lot of cases, politicians have bad days. I believe today, personally, based on our data, that this is a tipping point for Trump in terms of how he handled the COVID crisis.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask a question. How many social media platforms do you look at? So how comprehensive is your universe in order to be tracking the sentiment?
So for us, we pull in mostly Twitter. We have a real-time data feed to Twitter, which gives us about 80% more data than we need to be statistically meaningful, but we pull in as much as we can.
Great, okay. So that will take us perfectly over to Mark in terms of political risk. And I think that it's really exciting that you guys are more political science oriented than data oriented, but to see how you put it all together. Mark, can you just give us a little bit of an insight about the risks involved, maybe with either or? And then if you want us to switch your screen, can you just let us know and we'll toggle over to.
Yeah, that would be great. Actually, it would be helpful
okay.
to show the data itself. So while we're sorting that out, I just mention, I think our company, as I met in the introduction, we are political scientists. So we're gathering kind of traditional political science country data for every country we cover, including the United States, and then we are updating or kind of creating higher frequency signals out of that more traditionally low frequency country data, generally annually, with traditional media and social media signals, right? And so ultimately what we do is every day and every hour in some cases, but give it updated country risk score across a range of different dimensions for our clients based on both the structural conditions in the country, in terms of what kind of regime they have, how strong the government is, how divided the society is, what's the security environment, et cetera, things that you would usually rely on a country risk analyst to help you suss out, but also what the latest events are and how those events affect these various risks. And of course, one of those risks is election, and both in terms of more mundanely policy change when you get turnover of power, but in some cases, historically more in emerging markets, there is social and security risks that stem around elections. when they're particularly, when societies are particularly polarized, or when the election outcome is particularly politicized. And what's unique, what's notable about this election for the United States is that, in part based on trends that have developed since before the last election, the United States in our data looks more and more like an emerging market where you know, the risks around this election are not just about policy change, and which of course are important, but also about the kind of underlying social and political stability of the polity around an election that's particularly contentious. And that is new for a, you know, developed market like the United States. So I believe I can now.
Wow. You can probably screen share now. Yeah.
Yeah. Screen share. So let me put some kind of data behind what I mean by that. So, you know, what we do, and you're seeing our kind of main dashboard here, is measure this idea of country risk, what we call political risk, which is effectively country risk without the economics. The economic elements of what, and the market dynamics of what we're trying to predict. We really cover the political dynamics. In every country of the world, again, I'll focus on the United States, but, you know, our top line, we have a number of we have this system of measuring political fundamentals. We aggregate up. All of these are updated hourly, as I said. But this is what our overall kind of country political risk signal looks like for the United States today. Here's where we are today in terms of overall risk. Here's where we'll be in the election. Here's where we were in you know, around 2016 and election day. So we have just a fundamentally higher level of country risk in the United States than we did 4 years ago. Now, what does that mean for the incumbent and the likelihood that the incumbent will win or lose? I think, like Neil said, for 2016, at least the data that they were collecting was pretty unambiguous. Likewise for us, the direction of Biden, in that not only in general can we assume that a country that's you know, much higher risk than it was when the incumbent took over is more likely to see incumbent turnover, i.e. the incumbent is more likely to lose in conditions that are significantly riskier. But also, if we look directly at the kind of indicators we measure, like government instability risk, right, which is basically the risk that the incumbent government will fall. You know, this is where we were in 2016, and you know that we saw a significant increase. Here's where we are, you know, today. We still have a significant tightening trend going into the election toward the incumbent, toward Trump, so a decrease in risk, but the level of risk is just so much higher than 2016 or the midterms in 2014 or the midterms in 2018 that our data would suggest the incumbent's going to lose pretty unambiguously.
Can I ask a question? I thought it was really interesting that you said that our risk, or the risk of the United States, looks like one of an emerging country or an emerging market. Can you show us in real time, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, is there like an overlay of another country that?
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, just in terms of like on our overall risk score, you know, right now where we, and actually this is in the future, so it might take a while to load here, but where we stack, where the United States stacks, sorry, not to use the we, you know, in 2013 or so, it was more here in this range of kind of more, in our system at least, of more developed markets, and it's shifted, you know, here toward looking more like, in terms of, again, an overall country risk like a Hong Kong or an Italy or a Czech Republic or a Poland than it does a Japan or Australia, wow. Germany, a UK. So a lot of that is also part of the, you know, the reason why we think the incumbent will lose, and just in terms of the level of change over time in the United States relative to other developed markets in terms of political drivers. And then in addition, you know, not only the government instability indicator, but if you look at, say, social instability, which was, for us, a better predictor of 2016 dynamics. Here you see the kind of larger jump up in social instability before the 2016 election. There was some stabilization around you know, Trump kind of 2018, 2019, but it's gone again up so so much in the near term around COVID and around the protests that have dominated the kind of country's political scene over the past year, that again we're in a realm where we see that social instability risk increasing into the election. So I think that's a risk signal around the potential for more protests, for more political violence, for more the narrative of political instability to pick up around the election. But then also the fact that supports an incumbent losing when that looks a lot like and mirrors the trend in government instability, which we see here quite closely, right? So given that those two trends are so in alignment, that suggests the incumbent will lose.
So I'm asking a lot of questions. I want to encourage the audience or the attendees to ask questions as well, because I think that there's just a lot going on here. And then also anybody can chime in. So Neil, Tanya, Osman, I think this is a great way to launch into other conversations.
Did you want me to maintain my screen? Sorry, I didn't want to.
I don't know, it was pretty cool, but let's why don't we go to the holding slide. All right. Anybody want to add to Mark's presentation and notes about the political risk? I know we talked about the policy issues between trade and regulations and all the macroeconomic effects. There's issues that we can circle back to. I think Neil, you talked about the macroeconomic impact of these social and political issues as well. But I'm opening it up to Osman or Tanya, Neil, before we start taking it to the deep dive into the asset classes.
I mean, just my understanding, if I'm not mistaken, I didn't hear what Neil's expectation regarding the outcome of the election, but the Tanya's data, Mark's data indicate that Trump is the loser. That's what the data is showing, incumbent. And so let's say that is the 2 out of 3 saying that's the case. Now, from the investment side of it, how I can make money out of this mess? That's the bottom line, that everybody's your audience probably, that's the question that they are facing. And we can look at the historical data. Everybody has the access to that data. I don't have slides, but just is a common knowledge when you look at the long term, market has only one way. It's just been going up. But typically during the Democratic presidency, they outperform compared to the Republican presidency. And even though the policies, fiscal side of it is completely different in a sense, and the more taxes, more regulations, those type of things and so on, like 10.9% versus I was looking at data 7.3% only during the Republican presidencies and so on. You can go through, look at all those historical data and so on, but the bottom line is here, as you guys have indicated, all those social issues, pandemic, and every single thing, very divisive country. And the risk is extremely high. And the only thing that comes to my mind, which is at the elevated level, the VIX, the volatility index sitting at 30-31, which is unusually high. And going forward, typically like the mid-October and the later part of it, till the final outcome of the election, whenever it's going to be, which will be accepted by the parties, and the VIX is going to be up and up and up. So increased uncertainty that creates a tremendous amount of issue. And you can look at multiple classes of asset groups that we can talk about in the next cycle of the questioning. But that's what the way that I'm just looking at it. It's just the case if data shows that Biden is going to win, if he wins and then Trump accept that win, which is high line. And then you're looking at, his policies putting down, increasing the corporate rate from 21 to 28%. More regulations.
Which is a great segue to Tanya had a good point at one time when we had a conversation, is that Trump has come out against ESG. So let's bring it back to alternative data. And, ESG is a really big part of alternative data. And there's been, I guess there was a pledge of 140 corporations to adopt ESG, by a certain date. I'm not the expert, you guys are. So I'm curious to see, what will happen with the ESG sector of alternative data, with one or the other.
I think when I was talking about ESG and how it's related to Trump versus Biden, of course, Trump came out against ESG, saying, it specifically related to retirement funds. What I found interesting about that is that you're right. There's so many corporations and countries who are completely committed to companies behaving and acting in a way that shows that they are committed to improving the environment around us, society, as well as having good governance. That it's interesting to us because it appears that he's almost polarizing the United States from the rest of, Europe is a leader in this area. So the way he did that, it seems to me it's in contrast, and also in the major corporations who are committed not only to environmental social governance, but also to the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a global initiative to, definitely improve and bring balance to, people, planet, and prosperity. But what I also find is interesting is that he's also polarizing himself against certain generations. Millennials are known as everyday change makers, and they are very socially active, digitally empowered, and are making sure that, things that are important to them, that their leaders are aligned with that. And there's also this, a tremendous devastation has happened from the coronavirus, and there's a whole population who want to get a feeling that they're doing something good, they're doing something right, and environmental social governance and the Sustainable Development Goals are a pathway for those kinds of feelings and positive things that happen that we are really looking for right now.
Great. Anybody want to jump in and add to that? I think this follows, Mark's data in terms of the polarization of the country. The emerging market countries that he spoke about. I mean, other than Italy, there's a lot of dissonance and discord, and I think that you're right that the polarization, the millennials are extremely purpose-driven. And if Trump gets reelected, then it's going to have a huge rumble effect throughout the country. But that's just on a very macro level. If anybody wants to contribute on a more micro level, I'd be happy to continue that point.
I mean, even in the macro level, if I may, is because the previous panel, and there was some confusion from my part, like the 145 or 245. So I joined at 145. So there was the previous panel, they was looking at data. It was very interesting. So I was looking at the global macro data, some of the analysis, the panelists, I don't remember their name, unfortunately. And it's showing that China's economic levels is basically at the pre-crisis level. US level is about 55% back. An expectation that he was putting based on his data, high frequency data, is as by the end of the year, we should be back to the, those kind of economic normalcy. Now, my question is here, even at the 2016, before the election, I have given a conference in London for a family offices. And that was a discussion was going on. There was a challenging times and all those type of things. And with the potential Trump presidency and so on, and this friction between China and US is here to stay if Trump's reelected. And that thing is going to be, I think, is going to get a lot more messier from that perspective. And how does it affect from macro level to the micro level? And small cap stock that you're looking at it, that's if Trump wins, there's a big if, of course. So you look at it, small cap stock can easily outperform because that supply chain somehow forcibly or whatever it is, will all those incentive, they are going to bring it back to the country or close to the country. So small cap stock can easily outperform during those years. But if Biden wins, that's the opposite side of it, and they will go back to the status quo of the world order of after the World War II, and which basically was very helpful to a country like China to become a superpower. And what happens to the US, us, in the next 5 years becomes a huge issue. Are we going to accept the fact that we may be the second instead of first. Those type of dilemma from the global macro perspective, but the global, the micro level, we can talk about more detail once you ask that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Neil, can you just tell us a little bit about how you predicted the 2016 election? Because I think that's fascinating. Like, what did you see that the rest of us didn't? And following on to Osman, I think that this would be a really interesting case study.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to respond to Osman and the prior panelists. I certainly do not see the People's Republic of China doing well now at all in our data, which is quite robust. In respect of 2016, we RIWI'd 1.1 million individuals or forecasters. We had 147,000 predictions. Mirror map of the United States using random domain intercept technology, which I invented originally for pandemic surveillance tracking in 2008. Essentially, people were RIWI'd as they randomly stumble upon a dormant, no longer commercially active domain. The RIWI machine learns in real time in order to get a true representative and random sample daily of the region of interest that you're looking at. That's how we did it. That's how we do it all the time. With respect to China now, and I really want to pick up on this, Osman, because it is the most important point. If a finance, if your China long short hedge fund strategy doesn't think about what's going on in China, then you don't have one. Certainly not a data-driven one. So I think we're really simplifying what's going on in terms of the implications of a Biden win versus a Trump win in terms of the implications for U.S.-China relations. They have a relatively similar policy. The Wall Street Journal reported on this today. I think we need to go more micro and look at categories. So, for example, higher education vertical. There's what we're finding in our data is there's educational nationalism taking place in China, such that historically we would have a lot of Chinese students come to America to want to study abroad. That's no longer happening. And I think for some period of time. So what does it mean for the next administration? Are they going to turn to India? Is India going to be the replacement? And Osman, you'll have, you're at the front face of this in an academic, which I have a foot in as well. I mean, so what does that mean? And that's just one example of getting a little bit more micro with our understanding of the relationship, because as we've learned, it's more than just about policy. It's about body language and other things and perceptions of a Biden presidency versus a Trump presidency vis-a-vis China-U.S. relations.
It's just, if I may, Neil, it was not my estimate that China was doing good. It was the panelists looking at. I do agree with you. I don't think China is doing good. I can tell you one thing. I was looking at the data right after that conversation. Is they came up with their August import-export data, which indicates that their export is booming. Import is down, even though they have been buying all those raw material for the increase of their stockpiles. But the funny thing is here, their FX reserve is not moving, it's not bulging. I know it's just staying around $3.1 trillion. Even making the adjustment on the the FX rates fluctuation, those type of things. So I am the type of person that I don't believe the Chinese data too much. And if they are struggling, they are struggling too. That's the bottom line that you're looking at. But the education side of it, I do agree with you. We do have challenges in the higher education. That is a micro level, not a macro level. Just we have somewhere around 500,000 plus Chinese students. And if Trump is re-elected, and that number is going to decline, I think, substantially. Both sides, from the both side of the angle. From the Biden presidency, it probably is going to be flexible. It may drop down a little bit. But I think that everybody has been trying to target India. But the problem with India, their private wealth level is not at a par with like the China, the development. They still need some time to go through. But it's very challenging. Whatever we have been doing in the higher education last 20 plus years is not going to work. It's not working now.
I don't mean to interrupt. I'm just mindful of the time. We have a really good question that popped up. So we have a question, and again, risk and governance are part of that, the alternative data model of the G and ESG. So they're asking, would love an explanation of how risk, as you're measuring and defining it, works against the incumbent. Often high risk favors conservative choices. So maybe that's over to Mark.
Sure.
Again, yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Thanks.
No worries. So that's a good point in that in kind of more uncertain or unstable situations, more conservative choices can be appealing. I think for us, the data is, again, relatively unambiguous that the trend in overall country risk tracks so closely the trend in government instability risk for the United States that the overall trend is probably negative for the incumbent, in that the riskier the country gets in terms of our model, the weaker the incumbent gets. And so, in this particular case, that relationship tells us this is bad for the incumbent. I would note, that same measure, that higher level of overall political risk or country risk in the United States, is very highly positively correlated with the S&P 500, right? So there's no relationship. In fact, it's the opposite in terms of higher risk, higher return for equities. But in terms of the political outcome, the correlation is pretty tight. And then in itself, the same for social instability risk. So because higher social instability can lead to kind of more conservative choices, but in this case, it's pretty clear from our data, this is not an ideological statement, it's not a partisan statement, it's just pretty clear from our data that the incumbent is the driver of the instability. The incumbent is the driver of the risk. As such, the incumbent is not the conservative choice for lowering risk. Again, that's not partisan. That's just seems like a pretty straightforward proposition that's backed up by our data.
That's great. Okay, fantastic. Okay, so maybe the last few minutes that we have, 4 minutes, we can talk about the effects on asset classes if Trump or Biden wins. And again, this is not a crystal ball, but just something that we spoke a little bit about in terms of what we're going to see. A, if Trump wins, and B, if Biden wins. So I'll toss it over to my revered panel.
So I could just quickly.
Nice everybody. How about the big tech? If Biden wins, big tech has been performing unbelievably. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of question in the marketplace. Is just they are overvalued, and so that's the bubble is gonna burst, like happen in the history of the market if you have been following it. And so it's just I think I've been just basically brainstorming on that one. And my take on this one, if Biden wins, first of all, we still have less than 2 months to go, and then the increased volatility right after the election night. I don't think anyone is going to accept the result of the election. It may go all the way to the Supreme Court, whatever it is. So till the end of the year, increased volatility in the marketplace, which market hates volatility, uncertainty. So the pressure overall in the marketplace is going to be done, my expectation. But let's say if Biden wins, I think the big tech is going to be phenomenal investment for looking forward next couple of years during his presidency. And because what COVID has done, it brought back, just basically brought back to all those potential future development and acceptance of the consumers digitalizing everything. That the speed, velocity of the change is unbelievable. So, but if Trump wins, I think his policies is going to go after, maybe the attorney general will go after from the big cap because you guys are too big. So you may see some struggle from that perspective and so on. That's the one group that comes to my mind. I can keep talking. You can notice, but we have only a couple of minutes. If anybody else wants to say something, I will happy to listen.
I fully support your exuberance and bullishness on big tech and productivity of the future. The narrative with respect to animus toward big tech transcends generations, transcends blue and red. And so that narrative can be played either way. So I think it's a bit orthogonal to your general thesis. I'm very interested in the online gig economy, which is growing as a share of the labor economy. So I'm very interested in how I do believe that certain gig economy type equities can be malignly or positively affected by a Biden versus a Trump win, simply because of their very different policy stances and body language towards whether or not these individuals are contractors or employees. So that's something to watch from a policy perspective.
So,
from our data, I would just summarize and say, regulatory risk is the one U.S. country risk which is actually negatively correlated with the S&P 500. In our data, I think regulatory risk is going up under a Biden administration and probably not as much under a Trump administration. That's, I think, relatively straightforward. When it comes to big tech, though, that's a sector that will be regulated either way. And that's not in our data, that's more my punditry, so take it for what it's worth. But I think the sentiment is in that direction. And the question is just about the certainty around that, that regulatory threat. And in a certain extent, just because the Biden administration will be more traditional process-based, there's probably less uncertainty in terms of the regulatory threat from a Biden administration than the Trump administration, where the Trump administration is more unpredictable in terms of the target of and the nature of the regulatory threat. So I think either way, big tech is coming under increasing regulatory pressure in the next administration to the extent that takes some steam out of the equity markets. And I think that's a pretty reliable bet. But markets hate uncertainty, as Osman said, and I think that uncertainty around that threat is going to be higher under Trump than Biden.
Tanya, any parting words?
No, just that when I think about ESG and I think about Trump's perspective, I think he's very focused on the environmental, and right now he really needs to be thinking about the social and governance aspects of it.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. So I have two things to say. Well, three things. One, thank you for everybody making the time. I really appreciate it. You guys are excellent contributors to this day. Second one is please book one-on-one meetings with GeoQuant, with RIWI, with Arenda. I think, as you can tell, you're going to have great conversations and you can ask difficult questions because they're up to the challenge.